Hi, everybody. My name is Devin Sweet with DMC Chartered Professional Accountants. A little background on me. I've been working with Lake Babine Nation for the last 8 years, since 2015 when I started auditing Lake Babine Nation. Since then, I've moved into partnership with DMC. So now my role is essentially making sure all our I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and making sure the audit process flows smoothly. Another big part of that audit process is LBN's finance department. So each year, basically, we come in typically for 2 weeks, go through all LBN's financial processes, procedures. We're looking at invoices, purchase orders, approvals, all these types of different documents. And Lake Babine's finance department really plays a crucial role in that, in getting us all that information, making sure that we can understand the processes in place to make sure that they are ultimately being followed. So I wanted to take this time to give a big shout out to LBN's finance department as a whole. Thanks to every one of you. Also, a big thank you to Marilyn. I think since I've started, she's been involved in some form or fashion in helping us get the audit done. So I know a few years she wasn't in the finance role, but still helped where she could and played a crucial role in getting the audit out in a timely fashion. So big thanks to the finance department. So I'll share my screen here and we can go through the PowerPoint that we've got for today. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen here. All right, so a little bit of an agenda. So we'll go through our audit report, have a look at some revenue and expenditures of Lake Babine Nation, have a look at kind of a snapshot of assets and liabilities as of March 31st, 2022. Look at some ratios that Indigenous Services Canada calculates. So each year they'll do a review basically to see financially where the nation's sitting. And based on those ratios, they can make recommendations to the First Nation, or different funding decisions are based on these ratios. So have a look at those, and then also a 7-year trend analysis. So first off, the audit report. So we have audited the financial statements up to March 31st, 2022. So basically an audit, there's different levels of assurance that we as external accountants can provide. An audit is the highest level of assurance. So it requires the most work. Basically, we're going in, we're looking at invoices, we're looking at approvals, all these different things to make sure that basically what you're telling us is the policy and procedure is actually being followed. So we're basically we're developing different tests to do different procedures that we do, looking at your information to make sure that everything looks accurate. So Chief and Counsel is responsible for the financial statement. So as part of our audit process, each year we meet with both directors and Chief and Counsel to go through the statements to make sure that they understand the statements and are comfortable with them. At the end of the day, they're the ones who are responsible and who have to sign the financial statements. So a big piece of the audit is making sure that everyone understands them. So we as external accountants, so DMC is responsible for expressing an opinion on the financial statements. So we're helping developing them. But again, a big part of the reason why we meet with Chief and Counsel is to make sure that they're comfortable with them, and that they're comfortable with the opinion that we're presenting on the financial statements. So this year, similar to previous years, we've issued what's called a qualified audit opinion. So this essentially means that the financial statements as a whole present fairly, except for one particular item, which has been the same for since I've been doing it, is the investment in band-owned entities. So we'll have a look at here. So basically the reason for the qualification, so the qualification basically just meaning that we can't determine whether or not there is an adjustment that might be necessary to this figure. So you'll see a list of all the different entities that are owned by LBN. So all of those entities, some the reporting isn't quite up to date, so we don't have any information on those. Other ones, they have a lower level of assurance engagement associated with them. So LBN has an audit completed. So basically we're doing extensive testing to make sure that the numbers are correct. Some of the other ones have a bit of a lower level of engagement. So we do a little bit less in terms of testing on those numbers. So the benefit to those entities, that's a heck of a lot cheaper not to have an audit. An audit tends to become more expensive just because of the nature of the work that we have to do. So in a lot of their cases, it doesn't make sense to have an audit completed on them just due to the cost of it. But it's important to note, so the investment in these entities, really that's for the membership, that's for chief and council. So the purpose of, a lot of times the purpose of having the audit completed is one, for the benefit of membership, but also for the benefit of the funders. So funders don't typically care about all of your other investments. So your investments in those companies, they're not too concerned whether or not that number is accurate. What they want to see is that the money that they're giving you, is that being spent in accordance with the finance or the funding agreement. So this qualification really has no effect on or bearing on their continued support of First Nation. So BLNDC still, so they have reporting up to June 2019, but nothing past that. So we're still waiting on further information so that we can update LBN's investment in BLNDC. Talek and the gas park companies are not quite up to March 31st, 2022. So I think both of those companies are working on getting everything caught up. So I'm hopeful that for 2023, those will all be in and we'll have accurate reporting for those entities. And there's a few other ones that have kind of, they're just basically shell companies that have been sitting there. So I was discussing with Victor and LBN's lawyer, just looking at getting some of those wound up so we can get them off of LBN's records. All right, so we'll have a look next at kind of the income statement. So this is looking at revenues and expenses of LBN. So first, revenues by type. So you'll see 3 years here, so 2020 up to 2022. So basically just a comparison of the different sources of funding and the funding amounts. So the first, the dark blue lines here, this is funding from ISK. So you'll see 2020, 2021 were fairly consistent, around 15 million. 2022 jumped up to about 21 million. So the big reason there was some capital funding for the Wayani drainage project of just about $5 million. Next, the little orange lines here. So this is all your non-ISK funded, but federal funding. So that's fairly consistent over the last 3 years. The other big one is this gray line here. So provincial funding. So you'll see under 5 million in 2020 up to just about 15 million in 2022. So a big portion of this is the foundation agreement, which we'll have a look at in the coming slides here. Green bar is all of your own source revenue. So this, again, fairly consistent over the last 3 years. So in your own source revenue, there's housing income. It's the majority of it is rent from houses, and then some other miscellaneous, some rent from some of your other facilities, bingo revenue, although there wasn't for the last couple of years. And next is the brown line, so other Aboriginal groups. So this is basically everything that doesn't fit under federal or provincial funding. So this is Pignata, First Nations Health Authority, First Nations Education Steering Committee, New Relationship Trust, all of these funders. So this one typically fluctuates year to year, depending on different funding sources that are received. The light blue here is First Nations Gaming. So this started in 2020. So basically as part of their revenue sharing agreement, each First Nation in BC receives some gaming money. So typically it's around 700,000 to $1 million. And then the last yellow is just other revenue that doesn't fit into any of these categories. So having a look at the foundation agreement, so kind of a summary of the foundation agreement as a whole and what's been received. So the actual agreement is broken down into 4 categories. So there's negotiation and implementation support, economic development, forestry, and then program enhancements. So negotiation and implementation, the total amount to be received by LBN is about 8 million. Up to March 31st, 2022, 2 million's been received. Forestry and economic development, the total amount to be funded between the two of them is 30 million. As at March 31st, all of that has been received. And then program enhancements, a total of 5 million, and 2 million has been received. So overall, there's about 9 million left to come from the province. So if we're looking at where these funds are actually sitting right now. So to date, the funds haven't been spent. They're all sitting in an investment account with RBC currently. So that account is earning a bit of interest while it sits in there. But it's my understanding that the funds aren't going to be used until a consultation process with membership happens. And then there's going to be some plans developed to ultimately determine how the funds are going to be spent. So yeah, so to date, none of these funds have been spent. They're just kind of in a holding account until the First Nation can decide what you're going to spend it on. So next we'll have a look at major expenditures of LBN. So we'll go through these really quick here. So the purple one, so wages and benefits, is about 11 million for the whole year. So I work with several other First Nations wages and benefits because LBN is a large organization. It always accounts for most of the expenses just due to the number of employees and staff that LBN supports. Other expenses, so included in other expenses, this orange item are things like insurance, community support, training, nutrition, interest and bank charges. So that's about 5 million. So 13% of the expenses in there. Capital purchases, which was about 4.9 million. So the big one there this year is the Wayani drainage project. There's a few vehicles, computer equipment purchases, things like that. Tuition and allowances for supporting LBN students is about 3 million. General supplies, about 2.4 million or 6%. Travel is about 2.1. So this includes patient travel, travel for staff members, directors, all that travel is included here. Amortization is about 1.9 million. So amortization, essentially what it is just how we're expensing the capital assets that are purchased. So if you purchase a truck, for example, we don't expense the whole truck in 1 year. Basically, we say that truck is going to last 10 years. So we're going to expense 1/10 of that truck every year, just so that we can still show the asset as an asset of Lake Babine Nation. And then once that 10 years lapses, then that truck essentially isn't an asset of Lake Babine Nation anymore because essentially it is worth next to nothing. The brown here is social assistance and support, about 1.7 million. The next dark gray here, bad debts of 1.7 million. So this is bad debt on housing. There was also a bad debt from CSFS from last year that wasn't received this year. The next one here, professional fees, about 1.4 million. So this is all your lawyers, consultants, accountant, all those types of things. Dark blue line, honorarium, So about 1.3 million. And the final one here, repairs and maintenance, is about 1.2 million, or 3% of the expenses. So repairs and maintenance is repairs and maintenance to all the houses, all the vehicles, buildings, all those types of things. All right, so this slide just shows the accumulated surplus or deficit by department. And I think what I want to highlight on this slide, if you look for those departments that are funded by Indigenous Services Canada or another funding agency. So if we look Child and Family Services, Social Development, Health Services, Education are the majority of the ones that are funded by an external party. So these ones, if you look at the surplus, you really don't want these to have a huge surplus. If there's a big surplus sitting in these ones, then the funding agency will come back and say, hey, we're paying too much, so they'll cut back on some of their programs. So these ones are all fairly close to this middle zero line, which is good. The big ones, capital assets and your equity and First Nation investments. So equity and First Nation investments, so this is your earnings from all of your owned entities. So forestry is the biggest one, BLNDC, Talek, and the gas bar companies. So all that gives you a surplus of about 18 million. Capital assets, so this is all of your buildings, infrastructure, vehicles, computer equipment, all this type of thing. So that totals to about $27 million in assets that the band holds. So overall, if you look at the graph kind of overall, there's two that are in the negative, so operation and maintenance and social housing. So the big reason for this is these departments are not funded, or at least not very well funded by external parties. So going forward, I think the nation needs to look at either own source revenue to cover these, or potentially looking at getting additional funding coming in so that these don't start creeping higher and higher, or lower and lower, I guess, into the negatives. So, but overall, if you look, there's quite a lot more that are in the positive. So overall, a very strong year for LBN. All right, so looking at a snapshot of where things are sitting as of March 31st. So this is all the assets of Lake Babine. So cash, about 2 million, just sitting in bank account. Restricted cash, so this is restricted for capital purchases. Short-term deposits, so you'll see compared to last year, so last year was about 11 million, this year 42 million. So the big increase this year was from the foundation agreement. So basically this is the investment account that those funds are sitting in, waiting to be spent on projects on a future date. Owed from funders, so again, a fairly substantial increase from the previous year. This is all your receivables from different funding agencies that was received shortly after March 31st. So the increase really is just a timing difference of when things are being received. A big chunk of that 7 million was an ISK payment that was received on April 1st of 2022. The next line is your investment in First Nations entities. So this again is all your investment in forestry, BLNDC, Talek, gas bars, all these companies. The increase from 2021, so the only one we have reporting for is forestry. So that just about 7.5 million was a direct increase from basically operations in forestry. So for the way that these First Nations entities work, so that doesn't necessarily represent cash that was paid from the forestry company to LBN. Basically what we do is, if LBN if forestry earns $1 million, LBN owns 100% of that business. So we show revenue of $1 million in that year, but the cash might flow up at a later date. But just for accounting purposes, we have to recognize the revenue in the year that it was actually earned. So this 18 million, or just about 19 million, then represents an asset to the First Nation because so they haven't yet paid it. So if forestry was to pay up all of their cash, this number would decrease, and then you'd see it show up in cash up top. The final line there is the Ottawa Trust Funds, a small increase there from some interest earned this year. So the other side of our assets is liabilities. So liabilities of LBN at the end of the year were accounts payable, which is your day-to-day payable. So for any vendor type payments, so it could be payroll, it could be paying utilities or a gas bill, account for 1.6 million. So fairly consistent with last year. Typically it hovers around this mark. Deferred revenue. So again, you'll see a big increase. So about 8 million last year, 32 million this year. So that increase is almost directly tied to the foundation agreement. So because that the foundation agreement, essentially they paid money earlier than originally anticipated. So it sits as deferred revenue until the fiscal year that they stipulate it should be recognized in. So so over the next 3 years, that balance will continue to come down. And then the final line, other long-term debt. So this is debt on different buildings, vehicles, and things like that. So overall, if you look at the assets and liabilities of the First Nation, so totaling our liabilities is about 40 million. And if we exclude this deferred revenue, so the deferred revenue, so long as the terms of the foundation agreement are adhered to, that this 32 million really should be should come off of your liabilities for the coming years. So if we exclude that, the total liabilities are about 8 million. If we go back and have a look at the assets of the First Nation, they're about 72 million. So an extremely healthy statement of financial position for 2022. Again, assets, if you total 2022, is about 72 million, and liabilities are about 40 million. If we exclude this deferred revenue, then only about 8 million. So an extremely healthy financial position and a great fiscal year for LBN. All right, so we'll look at some of the ISK ratios that they calculate. So we'll look at two of them here. So the first one, the adjusted liquidity ratio. Basically, this is a measure of LBN's ability to pay its current debt with the current assets that it holds. So this is kind of a short-term ratio looking at like a 1 fiscal year period. So basically April 2022 up to March 2023, can LBN continue to pay its debts that are coming due? So if you look, the dark blue line here is the benchmark set by ISK. So this benchmark is 0.9. Currently, LBN is at 1.4. So over the last 3 years, you guys have always been over the benchmark. So really, you know, a very healthy ratio for this year. There's really no concern that LBN can't support its current obligations. And the second ratio here is more long-term. So looking at all of the assets, all of the debt of the First Nation, how sustainable are you guys moving into the future? So the benchmark here, again, the dark blue line set by ISK is at 0.5. Currently, you guys are at about 1.3. So over double what the actual benchmark is, which is phenomenal. So again, looking back to the assets, liabilities. That's kind of where this ratio is derived from. So a really great year. You'll see in the coming slides too, we've got kind of a trend analysis to see kind of what has led up to this very high ratio. All right, so this is a 7-year summary of income and expenditures for Lake Babine Nation. So we've got from 2016 all the way up to 2022. So looking at the graph, the blue line represents revenue. Orange line here represents expenses. So you'll see kind of 2016 up to 2019, the revenue and expenses pretty well, they're fairly consistent, and they kind of mirror each other. So you'll see they keep kind of crossing over year. 2019 is where we really see a big, our revenue line starts to climb quite substantially. Expenses too, you'll see they're slowly climbing over those 3 years, but not as significantly as these revenues. So this is kind of what's led to such a great last couple financial years for Lake Babine. A big part of this is the foundation agreement and different funding sources. So when you're looking at this, really this is the direction that you want to see things heading. Your revenues exceeding your expenses. So there's a big gap between your revenue and your expenses down here. And also if you look at the amount of the increased revenue is increasing in greater quantities than the expenses are. So a great, really since 2019, it's been great financially for Lake Babine. And our final slide here, so looking at assets and liabilities of LBN. So again, we've got 2016 on the bottom all the way up to 2022. Blue line represents financial assets. So financial assets are essentially cash and things that can be converted to cash relatively quickly. So accounts receivable, essentially once that gets paid, it turns into cash really quickly. And your investment account, technically it's not cash, but you could convert it to cash almost immediately. So financial assets is all of your cash and cash-like items. Non-financial assets, so this is your tangible capital assets, all your infrastructure, buildings, vehicles, things like that. And then liabilities, so this is all of your day-to-day payables, your long-term debt, and deferred revenue. So again, if you look at the graph overall, so starting in 2016 up to 2019, things stay fairly consistent. And then you'll see the blue line really start to take off in 2019, 2020, up to 2022. So meaning that a lot more cash is coming into Lake Babine Nation. Again, a lot of this is attributed to the foundation agreement. And then you'll see from the liability side too. So this gray line also increases quite substantially from 2021 up to 2022. So this, as mentioned in previous slides, is also related to the foundation agreement. It's the deferred revenue portion. So because LBN still has some obligation to perform different things under the foundation agreement, it gets recognized as a liability until those terms are basically fulfilled. So as those terms are fulfilled, this liability in relation to that foundation agreement will drop down, probably consistent. Actually, I think it's lower. I think if we exclude the foundation agreement, you're down here at about 8 million. And then the final lines, or orange line here, so this is your tangible capital assets. So it should, in theory, this should, continue to slowly creep up as the First Nation grows, as it continues to purchase new equipment, new assets. If that kind of levels off or starts to decline, it can mean just that the First Nation isn't growing, or that there's no money basically to keep up on different capital expenses. So overall, again, looking at this trend analysis, a very healthy last few years. And it'll be interesting to, I'm excited to see the years to come. So that is the audit presentation for today. So if anyone has any questions, I've got my email up on the screen there. Feel free to email me. I can also jump on a call if that works better for anybody. Yeah, and also I just wanted to finish off by again saying thank you. Thank you to LBN Finance Department. It's crazy how fast the years go, but I'm happy that I can be a part of it and continue to give service to you guys. Thank you.